Hi. This is the first of a series of video lectures that we're going to have in music history throughout the year. Usually the video lecture will replace the class lecture, and then we will spend the following class spending all of our time listening to the music, studying the scores, doing exercises, things like that, to really kind of drive home the specific music we're talking about in the video lecture. So, History of Western Music by Donald J. Grout with a couple editors. Very famous book. We've talked about this in class. So these PowerPoints supplied by the publisher, I've edited them to fit the needs of the class. So, this very first chapter, we're not going to spend a lot of time on Chapter 1, which is Unit 1, Ancient Medieval Worlds. Chapter 1, Music in Antiquity. This is basically music before what we think of as the Middle Ages, starting around 400 or so AD. Frankly, it's interesting stuff. It's fascinating tracing back the history of music all the way to the earliest records or artifacts that we have, proving that music has existed in every culture that we know of, dating to 40,000 years BC, literally 40,000 years BC. But this is not music that you will necessarily ever be performing. It serves as a good foundation, and so what we're doing is a highly edited version of Chapter 1 here. But if you're really interested, there are extensive discussions, especially of Greek and Roman music. So please pursue that in Chapter 1 if you'd like to, but it's not something we're going to focus on in the course. So, Chapter 1, Music in Antiquity. How do we know that music existed 40,000 years ago? Well, there are records. Sometimes written records, sometimes other kinds of records. Of course, we have no recordings. Recording technology has only existed for about the last 150 years or less. But we do know that these societies, these cultures had music. Physical objects, musical instruments. There are surviving musical instruments, from a flute made out of a bone that they date at approximately 40,000 BC, so 42,000 years ago. Visual images, cave paintings representing music, and of course many other paintings and drawings dating all the way back through recorded history that represent music. Once they invented writing in Sumeria, people began to write about music, the fact that they were performing music, what the music was used for, and how they performed it. And then music preserved in notation. This is tricky because we do have things that we think are musical notation stretching back even before the Greeks, but we don't really know how to read it. We don't know what the intent of the notation was. We don't have, if you've ever heard of the Rosetta Stone, it's a very famous stone. It's in the British Museum. I've seen it. It's pretty cool. It's basically a big stone that had 3 different ancient languages on it, and they could not translate these ancient languages until they found this stone which had one language that they could translate, and it served as a key, as an index, so that they could translate these other languages, which is why that language learning software named themselves Rosetta Stone, because the Rosetta Stone was literally a key to learning these ancient languages, being able to translate them. We don't have a Rosetta Stone for some of these early notations, but some things we've been able to logic out. We have evidence of music making in all ancient cultures, in Middle East, in Turkey, Mesopotamia, which I don't know if they still teach this in schools or not, but that's the area between the Tigris and Euphrates River in the Middle East, which is present-day Iraq and Syria, and it's basically called the cradle of civilization. India, China, Egypt, among other civilizations, we do have some of this evidence, be it physical objects all the way through preserved music, that these ancient cultures did, in fact, perform music. Now, the one culture we're going to focus on is Greece. At one point, Greece was the dominant culture in Europe and Asia. Greece, of course, in the Mediterranean Sea. And basically, they controlled this area. Whatever you see here labeled, they controlled all the way down even into parts of northern Africa, all the way across Italy. The Greeks were eventually replaced by the Romans, but the Greek culture controlled a huge part of the civilized world. Now, we're going to spend a little time talking about the Greeks because they are the first culture that left behind a lot of evidence of music and music making, things that we can see and start to unravel how they made music and why they made music. So, images. Many images on pottery, on various decorative items. There are a few surviving instruments from the Greek culture and pictures of these instruments. So some people have actually built reproductions of some of these instruments. Many people wrote about music, and of course, this is a language that we can translate. So we know what they wrote and how they talked about it. And there are actually over 40 examples of printed music on papyrus and sometimes carved into stone of actual music notation that we have some idea of how to decipher. It's a great example. This is a highlight from the side of a vase. It's a man playing an aulos, which is a two-piped instrument. One of the pipes serves as a drone. The other one has fingering so you can change the pitch. There are hundreds of images like this showing the different instruments and the way the music was used. So we're going to jump around quite a bit. As I said, if you're interested, there's quite a bit of detail in this chapter on Greek musical thought, including a deep analysis of Greek musical theory, which is something we're not really going to get into. But the reason we're going to survey this, when I took music history many, many years ago, we actually skipped this unit completely. The teacher skipped this unit. His feeling was we're never going to perform Greek music and we're very tight on time, so we're going to skip it. But as we start to look through history, through the Middle Ages, to the Renaissance, classical era, even to the 20th century, we'll find people constantly referring back to the Greeks for inspiration, which is why I just wanted to touch on it a bit. So, very briefly, Pythagoras, who you may have heard of, if you've taken geometry, you're familiar with the Pythagorean theorem. He was a mathematician. He was also a music theorist, kind of the founder of music theory in Greece. What he discovered was that intervallic relationships are actually pure mathematics. If we think of the octave, which is the purest interval we know in Western music, where all of the beats, all of the overtones line up with each other, and it is, if it's in tune, hopefully, this very pure sound, well, that's a ratio of 2 to 1. If you think you're playing a note that vibrates 440 cycles per second, you play an octave lower, that's 220 cycles per second. The 440s divide the 220s exactly. If you play a note an octave higher, that's 880. So the math works out. Octave, purest interval. Perfect fifth, 3 to 2. If you're playing one note that's 600 cycles per second, and you play another note that's 900 cycles per second, well, there's your ratio. So, wait, is that math right? Let's go 400 and 600. I know that math's right. It's not quite as pure as an octave, but it's still the purest non-octave interval there is. A 4 to 3 ratio gives us the interval of a perfect fourth, another very consonant interval. So Pythagoras, being a mathematician and a music theorist, discovered that these things work out with these pure ratios. Ratios that still work today, obviously. Another thing that we got from the Greeks that we still deal with today is music and ethos. Many Greek writers believed that music could affect one's ethical character. Now, we hear this a lot today. Oh, that person's a bad person because they listen to the wrong music. Don't get me started on that. That's a societal thing. And I don't even, I don't have time to get into my feelings about that, except that it's, in my opinion, nonsense to a large degree. But they actually believed, the Greeks believed, not just that if you listen to music about stealing things that you're going to go steal things, but they actually believed that different modes, different scales affected your ethical character. And there are writers who wrote things like, if you were born into a position of leadership, if you're going to be a general or a senator or something like that, you should never listen to music in these certain modes because these certain modes will make you weak and indecisive. It's kind of fascinating stuff. They also believe that if your ethos, if you were out of emotional balance, that you could be returned to emotional balance by certain specific modes, depending on how you were out of balance. It's not scientifically provable by any sense of the imagination, but it is pretty interesting stuff as I said, which has permeated culturally for thousands of years now, even today. Something I think we kind of need to get back to in the public schools, some of the greatest thinkers in history, Plato, Aristotle, they believed that education, to be a truly well-rounded person, needed to focus on physical education, they said gymnastics, to discipline the body, and music, to discipline the mind. A truly well-rounded education is going to include not just your STEM, but also gym and the arts. Now, I think, as we all know, those are the first programs that they cut from public schools when they decide that the standardized tests are more important. Again, a thing that I don't really have time to get into, except to say that I disagree strenuously with this, as did Plato and Aristotle, and they're much smarter than I. They were much smarter than I ever will be. This just leads us up to Greek music. There are approximately 45 fragments of pieces of music that survive. We will listen to one of them in class, next class. Most of them are from late in the Greek culture, from approximately 400 or 500 BCE. Now, BC is a very common term, but BCE is actually the accepted term historically. It means before Common Era. So, approximately 400, 500 BCE, that's where the most of the fragments exist from. One would assume that they developed their musical notation a little later as the society developed, as most societies have. And also, of course, the older ones, well, there's that much more potential for them to be lost. If they were 1,000 years older, that's 1,000 years for these things to be destroyed or just to crumble. All of these examples use a notation that puts letters above the text. These notations above the text indicate notes and durations. Now, what we're going to listen to in class is called the Epitaph of Cyclos. This is actually a gravestone. It's a grave marker that has a poem inscribed on it, and above the poem, grave marker, above the poem, there are symbols. These symbols represent pitch and duration. This is what it looks like. This is what a modern transcription of it will look like. We're going to listen to this in class, and we will talk about the translation in class. So, to sum up chapter 1, from the Greeks, we got this idea from Plato that music can influence character, an idea that is still prevalent today. Medieval music theory and church music went back to Greek concepts, even to the point that medieval modes, the church modes that we will talk about extensively, were actually based on Greek concepts of modes, although there was actually a misunderstanding in the translation and they're not accurate, but they were trying to draw from the Greeks in that. When we got to the invention of opera, at the beginning of the Baroque era, late 1500s into 1600, they actually looked back to Greek drama. As a matter of fact, the Florentine Camerata, the group of Italian scholars who were trying to resurrect opera, or invent opera, actually what they were trying to do was resurrect Greek tragedy. And so, Greek drama, so these opera composers actually looked all the way back to the Greeks, for example. So those of you that are opera lovers, opera wouldn't even exist, certainly not in the form that it has developed in over the years, if it weren't for the influence of the Greeks. Lasting all the way in the 20th century. I mean, Igor Stravinsky, one of the greatest 20th century composers, actually wrote an opera, one cantata based on Oedipus Rex, the great tragedy by Sophocles. And there's your 20th century. So, that's the end of the PowerPoint for Chapter 1. As I said, this is a very quick skim over it, but if you're interested, the book has a lot more detail, and there is a homework assignment that I passed out in class, and everything you need to know to answer the questions on the homework assignment are in this lecture and this PowerPoint.